Hey there, everybody. It's Mike DiLisio, and well, it is winter spectacular time, and that means it's time for a lot of end-of-the-year lists, and I am very happy to be bringing to you my top 10 solo games of 2021. Now, this is a year that I didn't play probably as many solo games as I have in previous years. Still played quite a number, and there were a lot of really good solo games, as I hope this list will attest to. But maybe not as many as I played in years past, and let's see how this list shakes out, shall we? Let's get right into it. At number 10 is a big, sprawling epic of a game, Sleeping Gods. Now, Sleeping Gods is coming from Red Raven Games and designer and artist and publisher Ryan Laukat, and it is really a big, beautiful sandbox of a game. It is a adventure-style game, and if anything, it really kind of evokes the feel of something like Zelda Breath of the Wild in board game version, where you have the spiral-bound book, a very large spiral-bound book that's made up of a series of maps that are connected and kind of encompass this large world that you are exploring. And you are taking on the role of the crew, the captain and the crew of a ship, and you are trying to kind of go on adventures and go on quests and solve mysteries, and it's all done in this very, very sandboxy open world type of way where you can really go in any direction and do really whatever you want to do. Very, very, very fascinating game. I feel like even though I've played through an entire campaign and more, I feel like there is much, much more to explore. The reason why it's at 10 on my list as opposed to a little bit higher is that in the solo game, you really are controlling all of the characters, and that can be a little bit overwhelming as far as administering them. It's not terribly onerous. That's why it's still on the list. It's such a great game in general. But as a solo game, it is one that's still very good. I probably do prefer it multiplayer, but I have played through an entire campaign just solo, so it works very well that way. That's my number 10, Sleeping Gods. All right. Coming in at number 9 is another large game. This is Dice Throne Adventures. Now, this is based off of the Dice Throne system, which is really, in its original iteration, kind of a battle, almost a battle Yahtzee type of a game where you are taking on the role of a particular character. You've got some custom dice and cards that are unique to your character, and you're battling off against one or two or potentially three other of these characters, and it's a very head-to-head kind of confrontational game. What Dice Throne Adventures does is it takes that same system, and you can use the characters from Dice Throne in this system, and turns it into a cooperative dungeon crawl, which I think is great. And with it being fully cooperative, you can play it as a solo game, and it works very well as a solo game, where you can take on the role of one of these characters, and again, instead of battling against another player, you are working together, fighting against a series of larger and more tough enemies and going through a series of campaigns throughout this dungeon. Dice Throne Adventures continues on with this series of having amazing looking components, beautiful production, very large and lavish, and you can even get miniatures for it if you want to kind of heighten that thematic immersion. But I really loved Dice Throne, and I was thrilled to be able to get it in a format that allowed me to play it solo. So that's my number 9, Dice Throne Adventures. All right, coming in at number 8 is a much smaller game. This is really a small box, essentially card game called The Dead Eye. The Dead Eye is a very unique, it feels like a passion project. Just odd. It's odd. It doesn't play or look like any other game that I can think of. It has kind of a post-apocalyptic theme. It has a very stylized look that actually is stereoscopic, I believe that's the term, where you can play the game just as is, but it also comes with some 3D glasses that you could use that kind of add to this kind of almost ethereal, I don't know if that's the right terminology, but just it feeds into this unique visual aesthetic that it has. It's essentially a card game where you are trying to reach a series of destinations, and you're doing that by playing these cards that you have in your hand for one of two outcomes. You're either going to get, you're going on a particular, mission or goal, and you're either going to be getting a positive or a good outcome. Depending upon that, you are going to be able to progress further and further along on these runs, as they call them. So it's kind of an iterative game where you try to go further and further, and you can pause it at any point. It has a really nice system for kind of pausing your game and continuing on at a later point. It is one that really just plays in the palm of your hand. There is a little small board there, but that's just for organizational purposes. Really, everything is pretty much contained in the palm of your hand, and you play cards out on the table. Really unique game. It doesn't feel like anything out there, and that's why it made my list. Number 8, The Dead Eye. Coming in at number 7 is the card game version of one of my favorite games of all time. This is Mobile Markets, a Smartphone Inc. game. Now, you could kind of consider this as Smartphone Inc., the card game, and while that would be somewhat accurate, it feels very different. It's very much its own beast. It has some similarities, of course, with Smartphone Inc., but it is very much its own game. One of the things that I really appreciate about it is that it turns this kind of core experience where it's really an economic game where you are trying to create cell phones that you are selling to a market of customers. That's going to be a fluctuating market round by round. And you're trying to do so in such a way that you are making the most profit because you're setting the price on your phones. You are setting the particular features that your phones are going to have that particular customers may want. And you are trying to do so in such a way that you can potentially get access to those customers before other players. In the solo game, you are playing against an AI opponent called Steve Jr. And this is a nod back to the original Smartphone Inc., which had an AI opponent called Steve. Now, I always felt that Smartphone Inc., the base game, was not the best as a solo game. It's probably my favorite 5-player game of all time, but it didn't work as well solo. The expansion came out for that game and made it a better solo game, but I feel like Mobile Markets is the best iteration of Smartphone Inc. to play as a solo game. And so for that reason, it's number 7 on my list, Mobile Markets. All right, coming in at number 6 is Halia Great Houses. Now, this is actually an expansion to Halia Warring States, which was one of my favorite games from last year. And what this expansion does is a couple of things. It's a modular expansion. It adds some new elements to the Halia base game, but it also adds a full solitaire mode with, a potential for a campaign in there if you wanted to do so. So Great Houses is something that will set you up in a way that you are playing head-to-head against a virtual opponent. Really, the way Halia plays is kind of head-to-head battling where you've got your own kind of compound and you are playing cards from a market. You're purchasing cards, drafting cards, and you are building up kind of your tableau in front of you that have offensive abilities, defensive abilities. You can win in a multitude of ways. You can win just by knocking out your opponent's fortress. You can win by gaining a cultural victory. Some of your cards are cultural cards, and the way this works is that cards have dice triggers, and so you're rolling dice to trigger the abilities of the cards that you're getting out in front of you. And so the Great Houses expansion allows you to play against a pretty tough virtual opponent, and it feels very much like you are playing the game of Halia, and it's not difficult to administer the AI, something that I appreciate in solo games. And so whenever I can get a game that I really, really like that was never able to be played solo before, that now has a viable and robust solo mode, it always gets my attention. And that's why Halia Great Houses is my number 6. All right, coming in at number 5 is Let's Make a Bus Route, the dice game. Let's Make a Bus Route was a game from a few years ago from Sashi & Sashi, a Japanese publisher that was one of my favorite flip and write games. This was a multiplayer only game where you were trying to create a bus route on a dry erase board representing a Japanese city, I believe Tokyo, but I could be wrong there. And you are doing so by trying to pick up passengers and take them particular places. Now, Let's Make a Bus Route, the dice game, takes that same central conceit, the very similar feeling mechanics, but it turns it into a 1 or 2 player only game. And it has a very nice solitaire mode where you are really essentially trying to do the same thing but optimize. This is really kind of an optimization, efficiency type of a puzzle, and I tend to like those games quite a bit, where you are still doing the same core mechanic. Now, in Let's Make a Bus Route, the dice game, it is more focused on dice rolling, as you might expect by the name, than by card flips. But it still has that same feel, that same charm of Let's Make a Bus Route, and just in a package that is designed for 1 or 2 players only. Really solid solo game is Let's Make a Bus Route, the dice game. Coming in at number 4 is Merchant's Cove. This is a big, grandiose, asymmetric game, and the idea in Merchant's Cove is that you are playing as, surprise, surprise, a merchant, and you are trying to create goods that you are then going to be selling to customers who are coming into Merchant's Cove on boats. And the asymmetric nature of it is that every character is going to be creating those goods differently. So you might be playing as the alchemist, which has a little bit of a potion explosion marble type of a mini game. You might be playing as the blacksmith, which has a bit of a dice placement, dice manipulation type of a game. Or as the oracle, which has a kind of a roll and write type of a mechanic. So you are all doing things, you're doing the same things, you're making goods and getting them for sale, but you're doing them in a different way. So you would think that this would not lend itself well to a solo experience. However, the solo variant of Merchant's Cove is fantastic because you're playing against an AI opponent called the Peddler who allows you to play any of these other asymmetrical characters, and it works really well. It's still going to be competing for you with these customers. It's going to be competing with you for market sponsorships, and it is a very tough opponent and is something that allows you, again, to explore all of these different asymmetric characters. It does so with a very clever card-driven AI automa-style system that works really well. Merchant's Cove is a game that I have been very fond of this last year, and one of the reasons why I've been so excited about it is that I've been able to play it solo as well as multiplayer, and I've really enjoyed all of my plays of Merchant's Cove. All right, coming in at number 3 is my new favorite verb and verb game. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got roll and writes, you've got flip and writes, you've got all of these different types of things, but basically it's the idea of you're going to have either a sheet or 2 sheets in front of you, and you are marking things off based upon either flips of a card or rolls of a dice. This game is Hadrian's Wall. And Hadrian's Wall is coming from Garfield Games, which is a publisher that has produced a number of games that I've been very fond of. Hadrian's Wall is a heavy flip and write game. Heavy in the sense that you've got a whole lot of options ahead of you. Well, heavy in every sense, I think it's fair to say. There's a lot to consider in Hadrian's Wall. There are a lot of interconnecting mechanisms. Basically, what you're doing is you are flipping over a card that's going to tell you a number and type of workers that you have available to you that particular round. And you're going to be also choosing, as you play the game, end of game scoring goals that you are working towards. And so it's really nice because as the game progresses, you are constantly trying to have this kind of push and pull of using cards in such a way that they're giving you the resources that you need to be successful, but also using cards to determine what your end game goals are, scoring goals are. And I really like that. I also like that this is a game that gives you that kind of comboing feel that you tend to look, or I tend to look for in these roll and write, flip and write type games, but with much more involved. You've got 2 different sheets that you're working on, and you have to be thinking about so many different things. You're looking at these sheets, and it looks a little bit overwhelming, and it is a little overwhelming the first few times you play it. But as you get more comfortable with the system and how it works, it really all starts to come together. It feels like this clockwork, and you can focus on many different paths to victory. That's another thing that I like about it, is I have really approached this game in a number of different ways and have enjoyed it. That is Hadrian's Wall. Coming in at number 2 is a very ambitious, I would say, deck building game called Imperium Classics or Imperium Legends. They are basically 2 versions of the same game with different civilizations within. And so this is a deck building game based upon civilizations, ancient civilizations or legendary civilizations, as the corresponding titles would indicate. And so it is a heavy game. It's a game that had a pretty steep learning curve for me, but it really has paid off. That learning curve, that investment of time and energy that I spent into learning how this system works, paid off tremendously in droves with what a satisfying experience it is as a solo game. As a matter of fact, this is a game that is a multiplayer game that I prefer to play solo. It really is one that allows me to take my time, to really strategize, to work through these decks, because each civilization plays very differently than every other. They have different strengths and weaknesses. They've got different, sometimes winning conditions. And so it is a game that is complex. There are a lot of different card interactions, combos, triggers, bonuses that you have to be aware of and account for. And the AI system is one that is based off of kind of a series of flowcharts, and each civilization has its own individual priority flowchart that you consult. And so that can be, again, a little bit of a challenge at the beginning. It can feel a little bit overwhelming, but again, if you're willing to put in the time to learn this system, it pays off. It is such a rich experience. I feel like I could be playing this game for many, many years down the road. They've already released those 2 core boxes that each contain a large number of civilizations, and I feel like they could continue to add new civilizations, and I'll still be interested in checking them out. That is Imperium, Classics, or Legends. All right. Finally, my #1 solo game of 2021, and I say finally, that's a little nod to this game. It is Final Girl. Final Girl is a game that is really brand new at the time of this recording, and it shot up to the top of this list. And you might say, well, look, if it's this new, how can you already say that it's your #1 game of the year? There's a couple of reasons why. #1 is that Final Girl is an iteration, a kind of an evolution of a previously released game called Hostage Negotiator that I have played a ton. I played a lot of Hostage Negotiator over the years, which is a solo-only kind of it's not a deck building game per se, but you are using cards and dice that are going to trigger. The cards are going to, basically be the actions that you're going to take, and the dice are going to they're going to determine whether you are successful or not successful, or how successful you are on these actions that you're taking. Final Girl takes that core system and it changes the theme, and it adds a completely different kind of way you're interacting with that system. In Final Girl, you are playing in a kind of a slasher film, those old school like Friday the 13th or Halloween, those old school slasher, I guess they still make them, horror movies. You are the final girl. You're the last one alive. You're trying to be the last one alive that's going to finally defeat that bad killer who is at a particular location, and this is a modular system. So you can play with the core box. You have to, of course, have the core box, and then you've got all of these different modular boxes where you can play as different final girls that have different abilities. You can play in different locations that all have different setups and different kind of twists to the system. And you face off against different killers that all have different strengths and weaknesses and little tweaks again to the system. So it's a very modular, open-ended system that's built around the same core of card-driven actions with dice to determine your success or failure on that. It's a very tough game. It's very difficult to win, but it is very satisfying, and the theme is fantastic. Everything that Final Girl has added to what I was familiar with in Hostage Negotiator is a positive. Everything that they've added is something I'm like, yep, that's better. Yep, that's better. This is what's got me reinvigorated. I had kind of gotten a little burned out on Hostage Negotiator. This has taken that system and reinvigorated it and gotten me tremendously excited about where this continues to go, because it already has a large number of different ways you can play it. And I cannot wait to see what they do. I can already kind of tell that there's a lot of neat little tweaks that you can make to the system to keep it compelling, to keep you coming back for more. It is a solo-only game, which is, again, something that is also really nice to see that a publisher and designers are putting this much effort into a really tremendous looking and feeling product that is really just for solo gamers. So that's why Final Girl is my #1 solo game of 2021. All right, well, been a great year. Hopefully you solo gamers have found a lot of things that you have enjoyed playing. Let me know in the comments below what you think about your favorite solo games of 2021. And this is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.